The great warship floated in silence above a dying star. Its surface was covered with scars from past battles, long scratches of fire and metal burns that told the story of wars fought without end. Inside the ship, warriors moved with pride. They were tall, strong, and carried themselves with the confidence of a race that had known only victory. They were called the Dravari, and their power came not only from their strength but from the legendary armor worn by their best fighters. But now, one of those armors lay broken. Commander Lyra stood in the war hall, her armor spread across a metal table. The armor was dark silver, marked with glowing veins of energy. Once it had shined with power, but now the light flickered weakly like a dying flame. For weeks, the Dravari engineers had tried to repair it. Each one had stepped forward with tools, pride in their voices, only to fail and leave in shame. The crew whispered about it. Some said the armor had been cursed. Others said the commander had fought too many battles and the armor had given up on her. Lyra herself said nothing. She simply waited, arms crossed, her eyes cold as steel. It was then that a human walked into the hall. His name was Daniel. He looked very different from the others. Shorter, lighter, his hands not covered in scars like the warriors around him. His dark hair was messy from long hours of work, and his clothes were simple, marked with stains from machines. He was not a fighter, and everyone could see it. To the Dravari, he looked fragile, like a bird that could be crushed by a careless step. The crew laughed when he arrived. "This one warrior said. "He cannot even lift a blade. He will fail like the rest," another muttered. "Why waste time with a human?" Daniel ignored them. He had heard such words before. He knew he would hear them again. Slowly, he stepped closer to the table, his eyes fixed on the broken armor. His fingers brushed the surface, feeling the cool metal and the faint hum of energy inside. Lyra's voice cut through the hall. "Human," she said, her tone sharp. "You have been called because my armor does not breathe with life. You will try. If you fail, you will leave and not return." Daniel looked up at her. She was tall, her shoulders broad, her presence filling the hall with power. Her eyes glowed faintly, the mark of a Dravari warrior. But Daniel did not flinch. He simply nodded once. "I'll do my best," he said quietly. The warriors around them scoffed at his calm voice. They expected fear, but Daniel showed none. He pulled a small kit from his belt and began to work. The hall grew silent as he studied the armor. Where the Dravari had used force, Daniel used patience. He examined each crack, each broken line of energy, each worn piece of metal. He muttered to himself, his mind running through ideas. His hands were steady, moving with care as he opened hidden panels that no one else had noticed. Lyra watched him closely. At first, she expected him to fail quickly, but then she noticed something strange. He never rushed. Where her engineers had grown frustrated, Daniel remained calm. He leaned close to the armor, his eyes sharp as if he could see details invisible to others. "What is he doing?" one warrior whispered. "He wastes time," another growled. But Lyra was not so sure. Something about the human's focus made her hesitate. Daniel adjusted small wires, replaced broken parts with tiny tools he had built himself. He tapped softly on energy conduits, listening to the faint hum inside. To him, it was like solving a puzzle. The armor did not need force, it needed understanding. Hours passed. Sweat gathered on his forehead, but his hands never stopped. At one point, sparks burst out and several warriors laughed, saying, "He has broken it further." But Daniel only smiled faintly and kept working. Finally, as the hall's lights dimmed into evening mode, Daniel stepped back. He pressed a button on the chest plate of the armor. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a soft glow spread across the metal. The veins of energy lit up, brighter and brighter, until the whole armor shone with power once again. The hall fell silent. The warriors who had mocked him earlier now stared with wide eyes. The armor hummed with life, steady and strong. Daniel had not only repaired it, he had stabilized it. The glow was cleaner, smoother, as if the armor itself was stronger than before. Lyra stepped forward. She placed her hand on the armor, feeling the power flow through it once again. For weeks she had felt as if she had lost part of herself, but now, because of the human's hands, it had returned. She looked at Daniel. For a long moment she said nothing. Her crew waited tense. At last her voice filled the hall. "Only the human engineer fixed this armor," she said slowly. Her eyes lingered on him, sharp and thoughtful. Daniel stood quietly, wiping his hands on a cloth. He did not boast. He did not smile in victory. He only gave a small nod, as if this was what he had expected all along. The crew did not cheer. They were too stunned. But deep inside, something had shifted. The fragile human had done what none of them could, and Commander Lyra was beginning to see that there was more strength in him than met the eye. The warship was quiet after the repair. The crew still whispered about what they had seen, but no one spoke openly in front of Commander Lyra. For the Dravari, admitting surprise or respect for a human was not easy. They were proud, and their pride kept their mouths closed. Daniel returned to his small quarters near the lower decks. His room was plain, a narrow bed, a small desk with tools, and shelves filled with scraps of metal he had collected. He sat down, tired but calm. He knew what the Dravari thought of him. To them, he was still weak, still an outsider. Fixing the armor did not change their hearts overnight. But to Lyra, things were different. She stood in the war hall long after the others had left. Her hand rested on the armor, now glowing with steady power. She could feel the strength inside it. It felt alive again. She remembered Daniel's quiet focus, the way he had not flinched even when sparks flew. She thought of how he had worked for hours, never giving up. It was unlike her people. For the first time, Lyra wondered if humans carried a different kind of strength, one that her people had never respected. The next day, Lyra summoned Daniel back to the hall. When he arrived, he found her waiting in full armor. The silver plates fit her body perfectly, glowing with fresh energy. The sight of her was striking, like a living storm ready for battle. She looked down at him and said, "You improved it." Daniel blinked. "Improved?" Lyra nodded slowly. "The energy flow is smoother. The armor responds faster. You did more than repair it. You changed it." Daniel scratched the back of his neck. The original design was good, but a little unstable. "I just adjusted a few things." Her eyes narrowed. "A few things," she repeated. "No Dravari could do it, yet you call it small." Daniel shrugged. "Sometimes small things matter most." There was silence. Several warriors stood nearby listening. They exchanged glances, clearly uneasy with the way their commander was speaking to a human. But none dared interrupt. Lyra finally said, "You will work with me. My armor must never fail. You will keep it that way." Daniel hesitated. He had expected to return to the lower decks repairing simple machines. Now he was being asked to serve directly under the most respected warrior on the ship. "If that's what you need," he said carefully. Lyra nodded once. "It is." Days turned into weeks. Daniel became a constant presence near the commander. He worked on her armor often, checking its systems after training or battle exercises. Each time he found small flaws, tiny cracks, loose connections, unstable energy lines, and fixed them. He explained his work in simple terms, but most of the crew could not follow his way of thinking. Lyra, however, listened. She asked questions, curious about how his mind worked. Slowly, she began to understand that his way of seeing machines was not just skill. It was creativity. Where her people followed tradition, Daniel invented. Where they forced solutions, he searched for balance. One evening, Lyra called him to the training hall. Warriors were sparring, their blades clashing loudly. Lyra had just finished a round, her armor glowing with power. She stood tall, breathing steadily, her eyes sharp. She looked at Daniel and asked, "Why do you not fight?" Daniel was surprised by the question. "I'm not a warrior," he said. "I fix things." "Every Dravari is a warrior," Lyra said firmly. "Even our engineers train for battle." Daniel smiled faintly. "That explains why they break things instead of fixing them." For a moment there was silence. Then one of the nearby warriors growled angrily. But Lyra raised her hand, stopping him. She was not offended. In fact, she almost looked amused. "You speak boldly for one so fragile," she said. "I speak truth," Daniel replied calmly. Lyra studied him for a long moment, then turned away. But deep inside, something in her was shifting. She had never met anyone who spoke to her so directly, without fear. The more time Daniel spent with Lyra, the more the crew noticed. Some began to respect him quietly, impressed by his results. Others grew jealous, whispering that the human had bewitched their commander. One night, two warriors cornered Daniel in a narrow corridor. "You think you are special because you touched her armor," one said coldly. "But you are nothing." Daniel stayed calm. "Then why are you so worried about nothing?" The warriors scowled, their fists tightening. Before they could act, Lyra appeared at the end of the corridor. Her voice rang like steel. Enough. The two warriors froze. Lyra stepped forward, her eyes burning. If he is nothing, then why do you fear him? If he is weak, then why does he succeed where you fail? The warriors lowered their heads in shame. Lyra turned to Daniel. You are under my protection. No one touches you. Daniel nodded, though he still looked calm, as if he had expected no less. The warriors left, and Lyra walked beside Daniel. For the first time, she said quietly, You do not fear them. Daniel shook his head. I don't need to. They don't understand me, but you understand enough. Lyra stopped, her gaze fixed on him. For a moment, neither spoke. There was something unspoken between them, something neither could name. That night, Lyra could not sleep. She thought of the human's words, his calmness, his quiet strength. She had been raised to believe that only warriors had value. But Daniel was proving something different, that strength came in many forms. The next day, she wore her armor into battle practice. Daniel watched from the side, monitoring its systems. She fought with power and speed, her strikes cutting through the air. When she finished, her armor still glowed steadily. No flickers, no failures. She looked at Daniel across the hall. Her crew waited for her words. Only the human engineer keeps this armor alive, she said, her voice strong. Do not forget it, the hall was silent. Every warrior felt the weight of her declaration. Daniel lowered his gaze, quietly returning to his tools. He did not seek praise. But Lyra's words meant more than he would ever admit. And though the crew still struggled with their pride, they could not deny what they had seen. The fragile human had become part of their strength. And Lyra, though she would not say it aloud, was beginning to see him not as fragile at all. The warship sailed across dark space, its engines humming like a deep heartbeat. The crew trained, prepared, and sharpened their weapons for the battles ahead. For the Dravari, war was life. Yet among their halls of steel and fire, a quiet change was happening, because of a human engineer. Daniel had become a constant presence. Warriors who once mocked him now watched carefully when he worked, though many still refused to admit respect. Commander Lyra, however, no longer hid her trust. She relied on him not only for her armor but for her weapons and training gear. Every evening she came to him with requests. Check the power flow here. Adjust this blade's balance. Strengthen the shield output. Each time Daniel worked with calm focus, finding flaws and improving them. And each time, Lyra noticed how his mind never stopped searching for better ways to build. For the first time in her life, she began to see machines not as tools, but as living puzzles waiting to be understood. And she knew this change came from the human. One morning, the warship received a message. A rival faction had been spotted near a border world. They were preparing to attack. The Dravari ship was ordered to intercept. The announcement spread quickly. Warriors sharpened their blades, polished their armor, and shouted war songs. The sound echoed through the halls like thunder. But Daniel, as always, stayed quiet, sitting at his workbench preparing tools. Lyra entered the room, her presence filling the space. She was already in partial armor, silver plates shining under the lights. You heard the message, she said. Daniel nodded. I heard. You will stay here during the battle, she told him firmly. Daniel looked up. If I stay here, who will fix the systems if they fail? Lyra's eyes narrowed. It is not your place to fight. It is your place to survive. Daniel smiled faintly. Surviving is easier if I can keep your ship alive. Lyra studied him, silent for a moment. Then she said, You are bold, human, but do not be reckless. I'll do what needs to be done, Daniel replied simply. The ship prepared for battle. The warriors stood in lines, their armor glowing, their eyes fierce. Lyra stood at the front, her full armor humming with power. Daniel had fine-tuned it the night before, and she could feel the difference. It was like wearing a second skin, stronger than ever. As the ship drew near the enemy fleet, alarms blared. Red lights filled the halls. Cannons roared, shaking the walls. Warriors charged into dropships, ready to land on enemy vessels. Daniel moved quickly through the ship, monitoring systems. He rerouted power to shields, adjusted failing conduits, and repaired broken panels as explosions shook the hull. His hands worked faster than ever, each decision saving lives. Lyra fought at the front, her blade striking with deadly precision. The armor Daniel had repaired protected her from blows that would have killed others. Each time it glowed brighter, she silently remembered the human who had given it life. In the middle of the battle, a crisis struck. An enemy warship launched a beam that tore through part of the Dravari ship, damaging its main shield generator. Power flickered. Systems failed one by one. The crew panicked as enemy fire rained down on them. Daniel ran toward the generator room. Smoke filled the air, sparks flying like wild stars. Warriors had tried to fix the damage, but their brute methods made it worse. "Move," Daniel shouted. The warriors hesitated, but something in his voice made them step aside. Daniel threw himself into the chaos, crawling into tight spaces, hands covered in soot. He connected wires, sealed cracks, and rerouted power with speed that stunned the others. Minutes felt like hours. The enemy ship's fire grew stronger. Finally, with one last adjustment, Daniel slammed a panel closed. The generator roared back to life. The shields returned, glowing brighter than before. The crew cheered. "The human did it," someone shouted. Daniel only coughed from the smoke and said, "It'll hold, for now." Meanwhile, Lyra fought surrounded by enemies on the enemy warship. Her armor protected her, but even she could feel the weight of numbers pressing down. Just as a blade struck toward her, her armor flared with new energy, stronger than ever. She realized at once it was Daniel. He had redirected power from the ship to her armor, giving her strength in her most desperate moment. With renewed force, she cut down her enemies, her voice a roar that shook the battlefield. The Dravari pushed forward, their commander shining like a star of war. Hours later, the battle was won. The rival fleet lay in ruins, and the Dravari ship floated battered but alive. The crew returned with pride, though their armor was scratched and their bodies tired. In the war hall, Lyra stood before her people. Her armor still glowed with Daniel's improvements. She raised her voice so all could hear. "Today we live because of two strengths," she declared. "The strength of warriors and the strength of the human engineer." The hall fell silent. Warriors looked at Daniel, who stood quietly at the side, his clothes burned from smoke, his hands still dirty with ash. "Only the human engineer saved our ship," Lyra continued. "Only he kept my armor alive. Remember this truth." The crew bowed their heads, some with pride, some with shame, but none could deny her words. That night, Lyra found Daniel working again, even after the long battle. He sat at his desk, repairing small tools as if nothing had happened. "You should rest," she told him. Daniel glanced up. "I'll rest when the ship stops breaking." Lyra stepped closer. For a moment, she said nothing, only studied him. The human looked tired, his face lined with exhaustion, but his eyes were calm, steady as always. "You risked your life today," she said finally. "So did you," Daniel replied. "I am a warrior." "That is expected," Lyra said. Daniel smiled faintly. "And I am an engineer." "That is expected." Lyra felt something stir in her chest, something she could not name. She looked at him for a long time before speaking again. "You are not like others," she said softly. "Your strength is not loud, but it is real." "I see it now." Daniel said nothing. He only returned to his work, but his eyes met hers for a brief moment. And in that silent exchange, an unspoken bond grew stronger. The crew still whispered in the halls, some in doubt, others in admiration. But no matter what they thought, one truth had become clear. The human was no longer an outsider. He was part of their strength. And Commander Lyra, though she kept her voice calm, knew deep inside that her people's future might depend not just on warriors, but on the quiet human who fixed what no one else could. The warship drifted through quiet space after the great battle. The stars outside glimmered, calm and distant, but inside the ship, the air still carried the memory of fire and smoke. The crew moved with heavy steps, repairing what they could and cleaning blood from the floors. Victory had been theirs, but the scars of the fight remained. Daniel sat in the engine room, his hands busy with tools. He had been awake for nearly 2 days, repairing broken systems one after another. He could feel the weight of exhaustion, but his mind refused to rest. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw sparks, smoke, and failing wires. He had saved the ship once, but he knew it could fail again. Commander Lyra entered the room, her armor shining faintly even in the dim light. She had just returned from leading the warriors in repair duty. Her steps were heavy, but her eyes stayed sharp. "You are still working," she said, her voice low but firm. Daniel looked up, wiping grease from his hands. "The engines are stable now, but the conduits need more adjustments. If another fight comes too soon, we'll be in trouble." Lyra crossed her arms. "You push yourself harder than most warriors." Daniel gave a tired smile. "Machines don't rest, so I can't either." For a moment, Lyra said nothing. She simply watched him. She was used to warriors who boasted of their strength, who laughed even when tired. Daniel was different. His strength was quiet, steady, and without pride. Finally, she said, "Come. The council has called us. You will stand with me." Daniel blinked in surprise. "Me, why?" "Because they question you," Lyra answered. "And they must hear truth from the one who holds it." The council chamber was wide and tall, with pillars carved from black stone. High-ranking warriors sat in a circle, their eyes fixed on Lyra and Daniel as they entered. The air was heavy with tension. One elder warrior spoke first. "Commander Lyra, your victories are known. But rumors spread that your strength comes not from your hand but from this human," another added sharply. "The Dravari have never depended on outsiders. Why do you place your trust in one so fragile?" Lyra stood tall, her armor glowing faintly. "Because he has earned it," she said. "Because when our systems failed, he saved them. When my armor died, he gave it life again. Without him, the ship would already be ash." Murmurs spread across the chamber. Some warriors frowned, others shifted uneasily. The elder pointed at Daniel. "Human, step forward," Daniel did. He felt dozens of eyes piercing into him, but his face stayed calm. "Why do you help us?" the elder asked. "You are not Dravari. You are not a warrior. What do you gain?" Daniel thought for a moment before answering. "Because if I don't, people die. Because if something is broken, I fix it. That's who I am." The chamber fell silent. His words were simple, but the weight of them was clear. The elder studied him, then leaned back slowly. "Strange," he muttered. "A fragile one with a heart of iron." Lyra's voice rose again, strong and clear. "You question his worth because he is human. But worth is proven by deeds, not by blood. And this human has done more for us than any of you sitting in comfort here." Her words struck like a blade. Some elders frowned, but none could answer. After the council, Daniel walked beside Lyra through the long halls. The silence stretched until Lyra finally spoke. "You spoke well," she said. Daniel shook his head. "I just said the truth." Lyra glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "The truth is rare among leaders. Do not think it small." Daniel gave a faint smile, then returned his gaze to the floor. But deep inside, he felt something shift. He was no longer just an outsider. He was being seen, not as weak, but as someone who carried his own strength. Days later, the warship was ordered to patrol near the edge of Dravari space. It was a dangerous border, filled with raiders and rival clans. The crew grew tense, sharpening blades and checking armor more often than usual. Daniel prepared as well, though in his own way. He reinforced shield systems, tested energy lines, and repaired weapons that had not been touched since the last battle. The warriors watched him with new eyes now. Some even brought their personal gear to him, asking quietly if he could make improvements. For the first time, they sought his help, not with mockery, but with respect. The danger came sooner than expected. A fleet of raiders appeared out of the void, their ships fast and filled with firepower. They attacked without warning, swarming the Dravari warship like wolves on a wounded beast. The alarm screamed. The ship shook violently as blasts tore across its hull. Warriors rushed to battle stations, their voices rising in war cries. Daniel ran to the control deck. He saw screens flicker with warnings, shields failing, weapons overheating, engines straining. His heart pounded, but his hands moved quickly. "Reroute power from the secondary batteries," he shouted.
"Feed it into the shields now!"
The warriors at the consoles hesitated, unused to taking orders from him. But Lyra's voice cut through the chaos. "Do as he says." The warriors obeyed. The shield strengthened, glowing brighter just in time to block another wave of fire. Lyra turned to Daniel. "Stay with me. Guide the systems. I will lead the fight." Daniel nodded, already working. The battle raged. Enemy ships circled like vultures, firing relentlessly. Lyra commanded the warriors with power and precision, her armor glowing fiercely as she led boarding squads into enemy vessels. Each time her armor flared with life, Daniel smiled faintly. It was holding, but then disaster struck. A massive enemy ship appeared, larger than the rest. It fired a beam that tore into the Dravari vessel, cutting through shields and smashing into the power core. The lights dimmed. The ship shook violently. The crew panicked. Daniel ran to the core chamber. Smoke filled the air, wires burned, and alarms wailed. He could see at once that the damage was severe. If the core collapsed, the entire ship would be destroyed. He crawled into the broken chamber, ignoring the heat and sparks. His hands worked furiously, patching lines, sealing cracks, rerouting power. His mind raced faster than his body, searching for every possible solution. Outside, Lyra and her warriors fought desperately. Her armor protected her, but she could feel it weakening as the ship's systems faltered. She knew Daniel was down there, fighting his own battle against failure. "Hold, human," she whispered through clenched teeth as she cut down another foe. "Hold." Minutes passed like eternity. Finally, with a last spark and a deep hum, the core stabilized. Power surged through the ship, shields flaring back to life. The crew shouted in relief. The enemy ships were forced back, their advantage lost. Lyra pressed forward, leading her warriors in a final charge that destroyed the raider fleet. Victory was theirs again. When the smoke cleared, Lyra returned to the ship and found Daniel sitting on the floor near the core. His clothes scorched, his face pale with exhaustion, but he was alive. She stood over him, her armor glowing faintly in the dim light. For a moment she said nothing. She only looked at him, her eyes unreadable. Finally, she spoke softly, almost to herself. "Only the human engineer fixed this armor. Only he keeps this ship alive." Daniel gave a tired smile. "Just doing my job." Lyra's gaze lingered on him. Something had changed inside her. The human was no longer just an ally. He was becoming something far greater, someone she trusted with her life. The warship floated silently through deep space, the battle over, but the tension still heavy in the air. The crew moved cautiously, repairing hull damage, cleaning debris, and checking their armor and weapons. The Dravari had survived again, thanks to their strength, and thanks to one human who had changed everything. Daniel worked quietly in the armor bay, checking Lyra's armor for the final time after the last skirmish. Sparks flew softly as he adjusted small conduits and energy flows. Each movement was careful, precise, like a craftsman shaping a delicate sculpture. He had repaired this armor many times now, but every time it felt new, alive, and filled with possibility. Lyra entered the room. Her silver armor gleamed under the bay's lights. She had just returned from walking the decks, thanking warriors and inspecting damage. The battle had left her tired, but her eyes were sharp, glowing faintly with the power of the armor Daniel had repaired. "You never stop," she said softly, her voice carrying a mix of admiration and concern. Daniel looked up, wiping sweat from his forehead. "The armor doesn't rest, and neither should I. Systems fail when you least expect it." Lyra stepped closer. For the first time, her voice softened. "You have done more than I ever imagined. You saved lives, kept my armor alive, and earned the trust of my crew." Daniel's hands stilled for a moment. He didn't know how to respond. Praise was rare in his world, and even rarer here among warriors who valued strength above all else. "Thank you," she said simply, her eyes meeting his. The crew began to notice something extraordinary. Where Daniel walked, whispers followed, not mocking, not dismissive, but words of respect. Warriors who had doubted him now sought his advice. Some brought damaged gear to him. Others watched silently as he repaired and improved weapons with a quiet skill that seemed almost magical. Even Lyra's fiercest warriors, those who had scowled when Daniel first arrived, could not deny his talent. One by one, they began to see the truth. Humans were different, yes, but not weak. They were clever, courageous, and patient. And Daniel's courage had saved them more than once. In the mess hall that evening, warriors gathered around him quietly, discussing adjustments he had made to shields, weapons, and armor. They asked questions, listened, and even laughed at small jokes he made. Daniel smiled faintly. He did not boast. He only explained, fixed, and created. Lyra watched from a distance. She could see the change. The human had become not only a part of their ship, but a part of their lives. And she felt something stirring in her heart she had never expected. Respect, yes, but also something deeper. A few days later, the warship received a signal. A nearby system was under attack by rogue warships. Intelligence indicated that the enemy had grown bold, expecting the Dravari to be weakened after recent battles. Lyra gathered her warriors in the central hall. "We go to protect innocent lives," she said, her voice steady. We fight not for pride, not for territory, but for those who cannot defend themselves, and we fight together." The warriors cheered, their voices strong and proud. Then she looked at Daniel. "You will come with us," she said. He blinked in surprise. "Me?" "Yes," she replied firmly. "You will manage the armor, the shields, the systems. Without you, we cannot win this." Daniel hesitated for only a moment. Then he nodded. "Very well." The battle that followed was fierce. Rogue warships swarmed like dark shadows across the stars. The Dravari fought with power and skill, but the enemy was clever, attacking in ways no one had expected. Daniel moved among the control panels, adjusting shields, redistributing power and repairing damage as it occurred. Sparks flew, alarms blared, and the floor shook under the force of impact. Yet Daniel remained calm, focused, and precise. Lyra fought on the front lines. Her armor, glowing brighter than ever, carried her through the chaos. Every strike she made was stronger because Daniel's hands were steady at the controls, feeding energy into the armor at critical moments. She could feel his presence even without seeing him, guiding her, protecting her in ways no warrior could. The enemy attempted to isolate her, sending fast strike ships directly toward her location. Lyra's warriors followed, but the enemy's plan was clever. They sought to test the armor to see if it could fail under pressure. At that moment, Daniel acted. He rerouted power from auxiliary shields directly into Lyra's armor, stabilizing its energy. Her strikes became faster, her reflexes sharper. The enemy faltered, confused by her sudden strength. Lyra cut through their defenses with precision. Each movement was lethal yet controlled, the armor moving as if it were part of her body. And in the midst of the battle, she realized this victory was not hers alone. It belonged to the human who had made her armor more than metal. After hours of fighting, the enemy fleet was destroyed or scattered. The Dravari ship had taken damage, but the crew was alive, safe, and victorious. The hallways were filled with cheers, shouts, and the clanging of armor. Warriors congratulated each other, but many paused to look at Daniel, standing quietly at the control deck, exhausted but steady. Lyra approached him. The noise around them faded as she stood before him. For a moment she said nothing. Her eyes studied him, softening from the usual sharp glare of command. "You have done it again," she said finally. "You have kept us alive, not once, but twice now. Not just me, not just the armor, but all of us." Daniel lowered his gaze. "I only did what was needed." Lyra shook her head. "No, you did more than that. You showed us what humans can do. You showed us that strength comes in many forms, not just muscle, but courage, patience, and intelligence." Daniel's heart stirred at her words. He was not used to being recognized like this, and yet he felt a sense of belonging he had never known. Lyra's voice softened further. "Only the human engineer fixed this armor," she said, her eyes meeting his directly. "Only he saved my life. Only he gave us victory." Daniel looked up. Her eyes held respect, admiration, and something unspoken, something that went beyond duty or command. For the first time, he smiled openly. "Thank you," he said quietly. Lyra nodded slowly. "Do not think this ends here. You have earned your place among us. Not as a tool, not as a servant, but as one of us, as a part of our strength." That evening, the ship celebrated. Warriors laughed, shared stories, and repaired what they could. Daniel moved among them, quietly helping where he could, adjusting a shield here, tuning a weapon there. Lyra found him at the edge of the hall. She stood beside him, her armor glowing faintly in the soft lights. "You have changed my world," she said softly, "and perhaps my heart as well." Daniel looked at her, understanding without needing words. He had never sought glory, but here it was, in the quiet respect of those he had helped, and in the eyes of the warrior who had first doubted him. Lyra studied him for a long moment. Then she smiled faintly. "Come with me," she said. "Tomorrow we face new challenges, and I want you at my side." Daniel nodded. For the first time he felt fully at home among warriors, respected not for his strength of arm, but for the strength of his mind and his heart. And in that moment the bond between them was clear, one of trust, respect, and unspoken understanding. The human engineer had not only fixed the armor, but he had reshaped the way the Dravari saw the world. No one would ever forget it, because in the halls of the warship, in the eyes of the commander, and in the hearts of all who witnessed it, the human was no longer fragile. He was vital, he was strong, and he was their hero.